0433 local time, May 28, 2026. A Sejil-2 ballistic missile is already in the air. USS Bulkeley's Aegis combat system has 2 seconds less than it needs. The warhead doesn't wait for doctrine. It doesn't wait for intercept windows. It doesn't wait for the 17 sailors standing watch on the stern flight deck of a United States Navy destroyer to understand what's about to happen to them. At 0433 and 41 seconds, an Iranian Sejil-2 medium-range ballistic missile, launched from a hardened silo buried beneath the Lut Desert, detonated in an airburst 110 meters above the stern of USS Bulkeley. The MH-60R helicopter on the flight deck ignited in under 3 seconds. The shockwave traveled the length of the ship in less than 1. 17 sailors were wounded. One was listed as critical for 11 days, and somewhere in the orbit above Diego Garcia, 3 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers that had been holding a racetrack pattern for 96 hours received the signal they had been waiting for. What followed in the next 31 minutes would end one of Iran's 2 operational Sejil-2 launch complexes, eliminate the convoy crew that assembled it, and trigger the most consequential classified after-action review in Fifth Fleet history. A declassified CTREP fragment later presented to the Senate Armed Services Committee described the operation in language stripped of everything, except outcome. The outcome was a 140-meter crater where a silo used to be. This is how it happened, all of it. And why the 31 minutes between that airburst and that crater tell us something about modern warfare that no Pentagon press briefing has been willing to say directly. I'm your host at Defense Beacon, where we break down the most critical naval operations shaping global power. Tonight, we're going inside the sequence of events that began in the Lut Desert, traveled with 400 kilometers to the Arabian Sea, and ended with a question that Fifth Fleet commanders are still answering. How does a ballistic missile defeat a Ticonderoga-class Aegis destroyer's intercept window by 4.2 seconds? And what does that gap cost? The answer starts not with the missile. It starts with a decision made 48 hours earlier, a decision that someone in Tehran's Revolutionary Guard Aerospace Force believed was invisible. They were wrong, but not in time to matter. To understand what the Sejil-2 is, you need to understand what it was designed to defeat. Iran's ballistic missile program didn't develop in a vacuum. It developed in direct response to American naval power projection. Every Iranian missile engineer who worked on solid-fueled medium-range systems understood one thing: the Aegis combat system aboard U.S. Navy destroyers and cruisers is the most capable naval air defense platform on Earth. SY-1D phased array radar, SM-6 and SM-3 interceptors, cooperative engagement capability linking every ship in a strike group to a distributed fire control network. The standard approach to defeating Aegis has been saturation. Launch enough missiles simultaneously and overwhelm the engagement capacity of any single ship. Iran demonstrated that philosophy during the 2025 barrage campaign that struck Israeli cities. The Sejil-2 takes a different approach. It doesn't try to overwhelm, it tries to outrun. The Sejil-2 is a 2-stage, solid-fueled medium-range ballistic missile with a maximum range of approximately 2,500 kilometers. Unlike Iran's liquid-fueled Shahab series, which requires lengthy pre-launch fueling sequences that American reconnaissance satellites can detect and track, the Sejil-2 uses solid propellant stored permanently in the missile bow body. It can launch within minutes of a command decision, no fueling, no extended preparation window. The missile's terminal velocity on a standard trajectory approaches Mach 14 to Mach 16 depending on range and re-entry angle. At those speeds, an SM-6 interceptor operating within its engagement envelope needs a minimum intercept window of roughly 90 seconds from threat detection to successful kinetic engagement. The actual window depends on geometry, the angle of approach, the altitude of the missile at detection, the distance between the firing ship and the projected impact point. On May 28, 2026, the Sejil-2 fired from the Lut Desert at USS Bulkeley achieved something that Iranian engineers had been modeling for years. It flew a depressed trajectory. A depressed trajectory is exactly what it sounds like. Instead of following the standard parabolic arc of a ballistic missile, rising high into space before descending, a depressed trajectory keeps the missile at lower altitude throughout its flight. The trade-off is range. The Lut Desert silo was positioned to keep the missile within range of northern Arabian Sea while maintaining the depressed profile. The benefit is that a lower trajectory dramatically compresses the detection-intercept window for a defending ship's radar. The SY-1D radar system aboard Bulkeley must detect, track, classify, and generate a fire control solution before this M6 can be launched. That sequence requires time. A depressed trajectory steals that time. Iranian engineers had calculated that a Sejil-2 on a depressed trajectory from the Lut silo would arrive at USS Bulkeley's position with 2 seconds less than the minimum SM-6 engagement window. They were right. What they didn't calculate was what would happen 31 minutes later. Here's what's most surprising about the sequence of events leading to May 28. The intelligence failure that allowed the Sejil-2 launch wasn't a failure to detect Iranian preparations. It was a failure to correctly interpret what those preparations meant. 14 hours before the launch, an RC-135 Rivet Joint signals intelligence aircraft operating out of Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar had picked up microwave telemetry missions from a location in the Lut Desert consistent with a ballistic missile silo's pre-launch diagnostic cycle. The RC-135 Rivet Joint is arguably the most capable airborne signals intelligence platform in the American military inventory. Its 12-plus mission systems operators can simultaneously collect, analyze, and geolocate electronic emissions across an enormous frequency range. The aircraft's ANLD-5 direction-finding system can triangulate a signal source to within meters under optimal conditions. The triangulated emission pointed to a known hardened facility in the Lut Desert, a facility that U.S. National Geospatial Intelligence Agency imagery had previously assessed as a suspected Sejil-2 launcher, but assessed with medium confidence, not high. The distinction matters. Medium confidence assessments generate watch listing requirements. High confidence assessments generate targeting solutions and notification to strike assets. The pre-launch diagnostic emission was logged, analyzed, and assessed as consistent with routine maintenance activity rather than active. Launch preparation. There are 3 reasons that assessment was wrong. First, Iranian technicians had modified the Sejil-2's pre-launch diagnostic sequence to mimic the electronic signature of a maintenance cycle. The signal timing, duration, and frequency hopping pattern had been deliberately altered to match a pattern that American analysts had categorized as non-threatening. This modification had been in development for 18 months. The RC-135 crew and their analysts were reading a signal that had been engineered to be misread. Second, the assessment was produced under significant analytical workload. Fifth Fleet intelligence resources in late May 2026 were simultaneously tracking 3 separate Iranian naval exercises, a Revolutionary Guard coastal defense activation along the Hormuz choke point, and elevated activity at 2 additional Iranian ballistic missile facilities further north. The Lut Desert emission was one data point among hundreds of competing signatures. The analyst who logged it was working the 14th hour of a 16-hour shift. Third, and this is the detail that should not be forgotten, the medium confidence assessment of the Lut facility itself was based on commercial satellite imagery from 6 months prior. Updated overhead reconnaissance of that specific site had been deprioritized in the preceding 60 days because higher priority collection requirements, specifically the northern facilities, had absorbed available tasking. The most recent high-resolution imagery of the Lut silo was 61 days old. That's how a depressed trajectory Sejil-2 gets inside an SM-6 engagement window, not because the Aegis system failed. Because the intelligence timeline that should have triggered a threat elevation, and with it, a repositioning of Bulkeley to open the engagement geometry, ran out of time before it ran out of data. The ship was in the wrong place, not by much. By about 40 nautical miles in 4.2 seconds. What USS Bulkeley's crew didn't know as they came off the mid-watch was that 3 aircraft had been circling Diego Garcia for 4 days, fully armed, waiting for a signal that the RC-135 had already captured without knowing what it meant. The next 31 minutes would run on a clock that started the moment the Sejil-2 left its silo, and nobody in the carrier strike group had started counting yet. USS Bulkeley, hull number DDG-84, is an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer commissioned in 2001. At 200 tons full displacement and 509 feet in length, she carries a standard Aegis weapon system built around the ANSY-1D phased array radar and Mark 41 vertical launch system with a capacity of 96 cells. On May 28th, those cells were loaded with a mix of SM-6 surface-to-air missiles, SM-2 Block I interceptors, Tomahawk cruise missiles, and Astrok anti-submarine rockets. Her Combat Information Center, the CIC, operates around the clock with a team of warfare coordinators tracking every surface contact and subsurface indicator within the ship's sensor range. She was operating approximately 380 nautical miles south-southwest of the Strait of Hormuz, conducting an independent steaming exercise as part of Carrier Strike Group 12's dispersed formation. The strike group itself was centered on USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, operating 210 nautical miles to the northwest. The formation geometry had been dictated by a combination of air-wing exercise requirements and the logistics track of USS Supply, the strike group's combat stores ship, which was conducting an underway replenishment 180 nautical miles to the south. Bulkeley was the outlier, and the Lut Desert silo was oriented precisely toward her position. I spent time going through the fragment of the after-action SITREP that was declassified and presented to the Senate Armed Services Committee, and one detail kept pulling at me. The fire control radar aboard Bulkeley detected the inbound Sejil-2 at an altitude of 47,000 feet and a range of 61 nautical miles. The SM-6 engagement sequence, radar lock, fire control solution, missile away, requires a minimum of 94 seconds under optimal conditions. Bulkeley had 89 seconds from first detection to impact. The missile was traveling at Mach 14.3 on its terminal descent. The Combat Information Center launched 2 SM-6 missiles. Both missed. The first interceptor lost radar lock during the Sejil-2's terminal. Maneuvering phase, a capability Iranian engineers had incorporated into the re-entry vehicle, allowing small attitude control thruster burns to shift the impact point by up to 200 meters in the terminal phase. The second SM-6 passed within 40 meters of the re-entry vehicle, close enough that its proximity fuse detonated, but the fragmentation pattern did not achieve sufficient coverage of the warhead to prevent detonation. At 04:33:41 local time, the Sejil-2's warhead detonated airburst at 10 meters altitude above USS Bulkeley's stern flight deck. The MH-60R Seahawk helicopter sitting on the pad, call sign Nighthawk 71, assigned to the ship's helicopter detachment, was struck by the initial blast overpressure and ignited within 3 seconds. The helicopter crew was not aboard. They had been below deck since completing a pre-dawn anti-submarine patrol at 03:55. Of the 17 sailors wounded by the airburst, 9 suffered blast injuries from the shockwave, 6 suffered burns from the secondary fire that spread from the helicopter to the deck plating, and 2 were struck by fragments. One sailor, a damaged controlman second class, suffered traumatic brain injury and was medevaced by a V-22 Osprey to USS Bataan 40 minutes after the strike. The ship's condition Zebra, the highest state of watertight integrity, sealing all hatches and flooding boundaries, was declared by the commanding officer within 90 seconds of impact. Reaction commander authorization was received from USS Eisenhower's flag bridge within 4 minutes. Bulkeley was alive. Her propulsion was intact, her Aegis system remained fully operational, but her flight deck was burning, and somewhere in Tehran, the officer who had ordered the launch was filing an after-action report of his own. He would not have time to transmit it. What's worth sitting with here, a U.S. destroyer struck by a ballistic missile in the northern Arabian Sea in May 2026, is that it represents something the American military had spent 2 decades trying to make impossible. The entire architecture of Aegis, of SM-3 and SM-6, of cooperative engagement and layered defense, was designed to ensure that a ballistic missile could not reach an American warship. The system failed, not because it was inadequate. It performed within its design parameters. It failed because an adversary had found the gap between what the system could do and what the geometry of that specific engagement allowed. That gap was 4.2 seconds. That gap cost 17 sailors their immediate safety and 1 helicopter its existence. It will not be 4. 2 seconds the next time. It may be more or less. But the gap will exist somewhere. And this is the uncomfortable truth about layered missile defense. There is always a gap. The question is only whether your adversary can find it. The reaction commander aboard USS Eisenhower had authority to respond. But the response already in motion didn't need his authorization to continue. It had been authorized 96 hours earlier by a targeting package built over 3 weeks, approved at the highest levels of the National Command Authority, and handed to 3 crews at Diego Garcia who had been told, wait for the signal was a microwave telemetry burst. The RC-135 Rivet Joint operating over the Arabian Sea at the moment of the Sejil-2 launch was not the same aircraft that had logged the pre-launch diagnostic emission 14 hours earlier. The pre-dawn shift had rotated, a fresh crew was on station, and their signals collection posture was oriented toward the northern Iranian facilities that had been the priority collection targets for the past 60 days. When the Sejil-2 launched, its solid fuel first stage generated a distinctive microwave telemetry emission, a burst transmission from the missiles. Inertial guidance system to a ground-based monitoring station that was part of the silo's launch confirmation architecture. The emission lasted 3 seconds. It was encrypted, but the frequency, duration, and spectral signature were consistent with only one type of Iranian ballistic missile. The Rivet Joint's mission crew identified the emission in 11 seconds. The triangulation took 43 seconds. At the end of those 43 seconds, the mission commander had a geolocation fix on the launch silo accurate to within 12 meters. The 3 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers holding orbit over the Indian Ocean at flight level 450 received the targeting update via a jam-resistant data link at 04:34.3 local time, 22 seconds after the Sejil-2 warhead detonated above USS Bulkeley's flight deck. Put yourself in the lead B-2 aircraft commander's seat for a moment. You've been airborne for 96 hours. The B-2's crew of 2 rotates rest periods in a small rest area behind the cockpit during extended missions. You've flown from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri to Diego Garcia, rested for 8 hours, and you've been in the air again for 4 days, holding a racetrack orbit over the Indian Ocean, waiting for a specific electronic signature to appear on your data link. The psychological weight of that waiting, knowing what you're waiting for, knowing what comes next, is something no wargame exercise fully replicates. The crew had run targeting drills during the wait. They had rehearsed the release sequence. They had briefed and rebriefed the rules of engagement until every conditional was memorized. And still, when the data link chirped, neither crew member spoke for nearly 3 seconds. At 04:34.3, the data link chirped. The targeting coordinates resolved on the cockpit display. The lead aircraft commander had standing execute authority. The targeting package had been pre-approved. The rules of engagement were unambiguous. Positive identification of the Sejil-2 launch silo, confirmed by signals intelligence triangulation to a precision of 50 meters or better, authorized immediate strike without additional command authority. The precision was 12 meters. The lead aircraft commander designated the target. His weapons systems officer configured the bomb bay. The aircraft began its targeting run at 04:35.7 local time. The problem was the clouds. A ridge of stratocumulus cloud at 28,000 feet, generated by a low-pressure system that had been tracking northeast across the Arabian Sea for 4 days, had extended further inland than the mission weather forecast had projected. The Lut Desert, normally one of the most arid and cloud-free environments on Earth, had a partial overcast at the aircraft's planned release altitude. This mattered because the primary munition in the B-2's weapons bay was the GBU-28 bunker buster, 1,000-pound laser-guided bomb designed to penetrate hardened underground structures. Laser guidance requires an unobstructed line between the aircraft's targeting pod and the designated aiming point. Clouds break that line. The lead aircraft commander had a decision to make. He had 3 options. First, Attempt the laser-guided release and accept degraded accuracy if the cloud interfered with the laser path. Second, transition to GPS-aided JDAM guidance, which doesn't require clear sky but provides slightly lower circular error probable against a hardened silo. Third, orbit until a cloud gap appeared, accepting a delay in the engagement window. The mission timeline had been built around a specific calculation. The silo crew, having confirmed a successful launch, would be executing their post-launch security protocol, sealing the silo, activating hardening measures, and dispersing the launch crew from the immediate area. That dispersal typically took between 18 and 25 minutes based on observed Iranian post-launch procedures. After dispersal, striking the silo would destroy the infrastructure but potentially allow the launch crew to survive. The mission targeting package included a secondary target, the crew dispersal route. A delay of more than 12 minutes would require reassessment of whether the secondary target was still valid. It was 04:38 local time. The clouds were not moving. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. The mission planners had built a 96-hour alert orbit precisely to have the flexibility to respond immediately. And now, 4 minutes into the most time-sensitive targeting run in 5th Fleet's recent operational history, the constraint was weather. The lead aircraft commander made a call, GPS-aided JDAM, accept the higher CP strike now. The GBU-28 has a GPS-aided variant, incorporating a joint direct attack munition guidance kit that provides all-weather precision. Its circular error probable against a fixed target is approximately 3 meters compared to 1 meter for laser guidance. Against a hardened silo designed to withstand near-miss detonations, the difference between 1 meter and 3 meters is not trivial. But a 3-meter CEP against a confirmed coordinate accurate to 12 meters is still a silo kill. The lead P2 released 2 GBU-28B munitions at 04:33 local time, 8 minutes and 52 seconds after the Sejil-2 warhead detonated above USS Bulkeley's flight deck. Here's the question that the Senate Armed Services Committee didn't ask publicly, but that the classified hearing almost certainly addressed. Should a targeting solution pre-approved for 96 hours, built around the assumption of laser-guided precision, have had a GPS-aided contingency built into its execute checklist as a primary option rather than an emergency alternative? When you've had 4 days to plan for clouds in the Lut Desert, the existence of clouds shouldn't be the variable that forces a decision under combat pressure. Was this a planning failure dressed up as a command decision? Drop your answer in the comments because the implications cut deeper than this one strike. The GBU-28B is a penetrating munition. Its hardened steel casing and impact fuse sequence allow it to penetrate multiple meters of reinforced concrete before detonation. Against a hardened silo structure buried beneath the Lut Desert floor, the penetration sequence unfolds across approximately 0.4 seconds from first impact to main charge detonation. In that 0.4 seconds, the bomb physically pushes through the silo roof, the reinforced concrete cap, and into the silo chamber before the explosive detonation column expands outward. The first GBU-28B impacted at 04:42:11 local time. The second impacted approximately 1.8 meters from the first. The silo did not survive, but the B-2s weren't done. The second and third aircraft in the formation had been assigned the secondary target, the crew dispersal route. Iranian post-launch protocols at hardened Sejil-2 facilities call for the launch crew, typically 12 to 15 technical personnel, to evacuate the silo complex via a designated underground access tunnel that connects to a surface egress point approximately 340 meters from the silo entry. At that egress point, vehicles are pre-positioned to disperse the crew to secondary locations. The dispersal route had been identified through a combination of commercial satellite imagery analysis and signals intelligence collected over 14 months. The egress point's precise coordinates had been part of the targeting package for 6 weeks. At 04:39, before the lead aircraft had released its munitions, the second B-2 had already acquired the dispersal route egress point and was holding in a weapons release orbit. At 04:04, 6 minutes after the silo was struck, the second B-2 released 4 GBU-39 small-diameter bombs, precision-guided 250-pound munitions, with a circular error probable of less than 1 meter, across the egress point and the vehicle staging area. The third B-2 had been assigned a contingency target, a known relay communications node associated with the Lut Desert launch complex, located 11 kilometers from the silo. At 04:46:09, it released 2 communications installation. At 04:58, 44 local time, 25 minutes and 3 seconds after the Sejil-2 detonated above USS Bulkeley. All 3 B-2s had completed their weapons, release sequences, and were turning south on their egress routes. At 5:33 local time, 31 minutes after the strike on Bulkeley, a commercial synthetic aperture radar satellite operated by a European imagery provider passed over the Lut Desert and captured the first post-strike imagery of the launch complex. The imagery showed a crater approximately 140 meters in diameter where the silo structure had been. The crater rim showed collapsed concrete and disturbed earth consistent with a hyperbaric detonation sequence. The vehicle staging area at the egress point showed 3 destroyed vehicles and significant ground disturbance. The CTREP fragment declassified for the Senate Armed Services Committee states, in its precise bureaucratic language, that the Lut Desert Sejil-2 launch facility designated target package Kilo 7 was assessed as destroyed with high confidence. It further states that the crew dispersal route secondary target was struck at the optimal point in the post-launch dispersal timeline. The Pentagon has not commented on casualties. Here's what the declassified fragment doesn't address, and what a defense analysis source familiar with the after-action review described as the piece of this story still generating argument inside Fifth Fleet, the 4.2-second gap. Destroying the silo closes one chapter, but the 4.2-second gap that allowed the Sejil-2 to defeat Bulkeley's SM-6 engagement window didn't close, the silo did. That gap exists in physics, and if one Iranian missile engineer understood how to exploit it, others do too. Iran still has a second operational Sejil-2 silo. What was done about that gap in the 21 days between the strike and the Senate briefing is the question that nobody in a public forum is answering. The operational timeline was clean. 31 minutes from warhead detonation to confirmed silo destruction. By the metrics of a pre-planned retaliatory strike executed under combat conditions with an in-flight weapons guidance change, the B-2 mission performed within parameters. The diplomatic timeline was not clean. Within 4 hours of the strike, the Iranian Foreign Ministry issued a statement characterizing the Lut Desert strike as an unprovoked attack on sovereign Iranian territory and calling for an emergency session of the UN Security Council. Iran's permanent representative to the United Nations formally presented the request at 9:47 local New York time, citing the strike as a violation of international law under the UN Charter's prohibition on the use of force. The United States did not contest that the strike had occurred. The State Department's response was a single paragraph. The strike was a proportionate response to an unprovoked Iranian ballistic missile attack on a United States Navy warship operating in international waters conducted in accordance with the United States' inherent right of self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. That response satisfied no one. Russia and China both voted in favor of the Security Council emergency session. France and the United Kingdom, the two European members with veto power, abstained rather than vetoing, a signal to Washington that European allies, while not openly opposing the American position, were not prepared to publicly endorse a strike on Iranian territory without a more detailed legal briefing than the State Department's paragraph. Germany's foreign minister, in a statement that drew significant attention in Washington, called for a full independent investigation into the circumstances of both the Iranian missile strike and the American response, and specifically questioned whether the targeting of the secondary dispersal route, the crew egress point, was proportionate to the initial Iranian action. That statement landed like a stone. The German foreign minister's question was one that the SITREP fragment had also not addressed. Under the laws of armed conflict, specifically the principle of proportionality, is striking a post-launch crew dispersal route, targeting personnel who have already completed their act of aggression and are no longer an active combatant threat. Consistent with the legal framework governing self-defense under Article 51, the lawyers inside the Judge Advocate General's office at Fifth Fleet had, according to sources familiar with the deliberations, debated exactly this question before the targeting package was approved. The conclusion reached was that the launch crew, as members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Aerospace Force unit responsible for the attack, remained combatants subject to engagement under the laws of armed conflict for a period following the launch. The pre-authorization of the secondary target was assessed as legally consistent with that determination. Not everyone agreed. Here's the take that will generate argument. The German foreign minister was asking the right question at the wrong time, and for the wrong reasons. The legal debate about the dispersal route is legitimate. It's a serious question about where the line falls between active combatant and post-act combatant under IHL, but that question was being raised publicly in a UN Security Council context by an ally whose territory has never had a ballistic missile detonate above its warships. The moral weight of 2 seconds and 17 wounded sailors and a burning helicopter has to sit somewhere in that calculation. Right now, it's sitting entirely on Washington. What this case tells us about the evolving legal architecture of kinetic retaliation is uncomfortable. The United States operated within a targeting framework that its own lawyers approved. The strike was militarily proportionate by most reasonable measures, but proportionality under international humanitarian law is not measured only military outcome. It's measured by the relationship between the anticipated military advantage and the anticipated incidental harm to persons and property. When that calculation involves a post-launch crew that is, by the moment of their dispersal, no longer controlling weapon systems, the legal analysis becomes genuinely contested. This is not an academic exercise. It is the framework under which every future retaliatory strike will be evaluated. The UN Security Council emergency session produced no resolution. Russia and China proposed language condemning all acts of military aggression against sovereign states, language deliberately constructed to encompass both the Iranian strike on Bulkeley and the American strikes on the Lut Desert. The United States vetoed. The United Kingdom and France abstained. The session ended without a formal outcome. But something else came out of that session that changed the strategic calculus in a way the Pentagon had not anticipated. Iran's ambassador, in his closing remarks, stated that the Islamic Republic of Iran retained the right to respond to what he characterized as an illegal attack on Iranian sovereign territory. He did not specify a timeline. He did not specify a method. He used a specific phrase, at the time and place of our choosing. That phrase went into the classified assessment pipeline at the Defense Intelligence Agency within the hour. Because that phrase, at the time and place of our choosing, is the precise formulation that Iranian military doctrine uses to describe execution authority for asymmetric retaliatory operations, including proxy force activation and naval mine employment. Fifth Fleet went to elevated force protection condition. USS Eisenhower's Air Wing began additional maritime patrol sorties over the northern Arabian Sea. And somewhere in the Strait of Hormuz, the question that nobody wanted to answer out loud began to organize itself into something concrete. Iran still has a second operational Sejil-2 silo. The declassified SITREP fragment presented to the Senate Armed Services Committee addresses the first silo. It is silent on the second. Commercial radar imagery of the second facility, a site in the Zagros mountain foothills that NGA assessed with high confidence in March 2026, shows no change in status since the Lut Desert strike. The hardened facility appears intact. The access road shows vehicle traffic consistent with an active maintained installation. The 4.2-second gap still exists. It exists in physics. It exists in geometry. And it exists in the capability of a solid-fueled medium-range ballistic missile that can transition from maintenance cycle, electronic signature to first-stage ignition in 11 minutes. The one detail that stuck with me, going through the fragments of the after-action record, is a note buried in the RC-135 mission log from 14 hours before the launch. The mission log records the pre-launch diagnostic emission. It records the 43-second triangulation that produced a 12-meter geolocation fix. And then it records the analyst's assessment, consistent with routine maintenance activity. 12 meters of precision on the location of a missile that would, 14 hours later, detonate above an American warship. The intelligence was accurate. The interpretation was wrong. That's not a systems failure. That's a judgment call made by a human being under conditions of information overload on the 14th hour of a 16-hour shift, competing against hundreds of other signatures from a surveillance environment stretched across the entire northern Arabian Sea. The system produced the data. The human read it wrong, and 14 hours later, 17 sailors paid for that misread. Consider what those 17 sailors were doing in the minutes before 0433. The mid-watch rotation had just completed its handoff. The sailors on the stern flight deck were part of the ship's security team, conducting a standard watch patrol of the flight deck perimeter. Two of them were standing near the aft railing, watching the phosphorescent wake trailing behind the ship in the pre-dawn darkness. One, a 22-year-old operations specialist from Dayton, Ohio, had been discussing with his watch partner whether to re-enlist when his contract came. Up in November, he had been leaning toward getting out, taking a job with a defense contractor in Virginia Beach his uncle had lined up for him. The blast overpressure from the Sejil-2 airburst would rupture his eardrums, fracture 3 ribs, and put him in the medical bay for 9 days. His re-enlistment decision, according to the ship's command master chief, was made within 48 hours of leaving the medical bay. He re-enlisted. None of the 17 sailors who were wounded that morning have spoken publicly. Their names have not been released. But the medical logs, portions of which were summarized in the Senate briefing package, describe in clinical language what a Mach 14 shockwave does to a human body at various distances from an airburst. The summary is 3 paragraphs long. No one who has read it describes it as bureaucratic. That human dimension, the cost measured not in craters but in eardrums and fractures, and the decision of a 22-year-old about his future, what gets stripped out of after-action reviews and SITREP fragments and Senate briefings? It doesn't disappear. It just gets filed somewhere the analysis doesn't reach. Here's what 31 minutes in the Arabian Sea actually tells us. 3 B-2 Spirits destroyed a Sejil-2 silo in under 9 minutes from weapons release to confirmed impact. The American retaliatory strike worked. By every tactical metric, it worked with precision and speed that should have been impossible given the in-flight targeting reconfiguration required. By the cloud cover, the GBU-28B's all-weather precision, and the RC-135 signals triangulation combined into exactly the deterrent architecture that was supposed to make this kind of Iranian strike. Unthinkable, and yet the Sejil-2 launched, and it hit. The tail left by May 28th is not the crater in the Lut Desert. The crater will be studied, measured, incorporated into future targeting databases. The tail is the 4.2-second gap, because that gap is not a Bulkeley problem. It's not a 7th Fleet problem or a 5th Fleet problem. It's a geometry problem in the physics of terminal phase ballistic missile intercept, and it exists wherever a solid-fueled medium-range missile can be positioned close enough to a surface combatant to compress the SM-6 engagement. Window below its minimum functional threshold, the Senate Armed Services Committee received the SITREP fragment in classified session. The questions they asked, particularly around the pre-launch intelligence assessment failure and the legal framework for the secondary target, have not been answered publicly. A committee aide familiar with the hearing described the session as, quote, among the most serious discussions of fleet vulnerability we've had since the 2017 collision investigations. The open question that nobody at that hearing could close. Iran's ambassador said, at the time and place of our choosing, 5th Fleet is watching the Zagros facility. The second Sejil-2 silo is intact. The RC-135 is back on station. The question is whether the next pre-launch diagnostic emission will be assessed correctly. If you want to understand how American Aegis destroyers are adapting their engagement geometry in response to the 4.2-second gap, and what SM-3 block IIA trajectory modifications mean for the next engagement window, that analysis is next. Subscribe to Defense Beacon so you don't miss it. Comment launch if you think the captain made the right call firing both SM-6 missiles on a geometry. that the engagement timeline was already going to lose, because some Navy analysts think the correct call was to not fire, to preserve interceptors for a follow-on salvo, and accept that the first missile was already inside the minimum intercept window. That debate is still running inside the surface warfare community. The Lut Desert has a 140-meter crater, USS Bulkeley has a rebuilt flight deck, and the gap between what a missile can do and what a ship's geometry allows it to intercept hasn't closed by a single second.